Hey folks, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you. This is AP Government Topic 2.8, focusing in on the judicial branch. In this video, we're taking a look at civil law versus criminal law. There's basically the two realms of law in our legal system. First off, taking a look at criminal law. As the name implies, criminal law is focused in on cases where somebody or something has been accused of breaking the law, meaning that there's an assumed violation of some sort of the legal code, something that is written, something that is down in writing, be it U.S. code or Ohio Revised Code, something along those lines. Now, since it involves an allegation of breaking the law, instead of there being a plaintiff, there is the position of the prosecution as a litigant. And the only possible prosecutor is the government, be it the federal government in a federal case or the state government in a state case. People individually cannot charge somebody with a crime because individuals do not make laws, government makes laws. So that's kind of where we talk about this. Now, in a criminal case, obviously due process is to be followed. In the actual trial, you've got witnesses called on each side. There's evidence presented on each side. The witnesses are examined and cross-examined, yada, yada, yada. And then it gets to the jury. Now, in a criminal case, the jury has to make a decision. Each of the members of the jury, say it's 12 members of the jury, they have to decide, is this defendant guilty of the charge that has been brought against them, or the innocent, not guilty, or should be acquitted. Now, if you're looking for a conviction, you have to get all 12 of those jurors to agree to convict. And that conviction has to be based on being beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, these 12 jurors have to believe almost to 100% certainty that this person has violated the law, that this person has committed the crime that's been alleged against them. So when we say guilty, when we're talking about beyond a reasonable doubt, that is an extremely high bar that is to be achieved in order to convict someone. And once again, you got to have all the jurors agree to that standard to get the conviction. So convictions are not necessarily an easy thing to have happen. Now, conversely, if you're talking about being acquitted of a crime, those jurors would then have to unanimously vote to acquit you. In other words, they all unanimously believe that the prosecution has not provided enough evidence that would show beyond a reasonable doubt that this person is guilty of the crime. Now, you might be wondering, okay, well, conviction, you got to have all agree to convict, or an acquittal, all 12 to agree to an acquittal. Well, what do you do if you don't get a unanimous vote one way or the other? Well, first off, judges really try to push juries to keep talking, keep working, keep debating, keep discussing, try to build a consensus to try to get a verdict. They will have them spend days, if necessary, to try to do that. But there are situations sometimes where, the foreman of a jury might tell the judge, listen, Your Honor, we are at an impasse. We cannot come to an agreement. It looks like nobody's willing to budge. Nobody's really willing to change their mind. And if that's the case, then that's what's called a mistrial. And basically the way it works typically is that with there being a mistrial, it will be believed that the trial really never happened. So the person who's been accused of the crime gets to walk, but the government also has the ability to charge that person again and it not be a violation of Fifth Amendment double jeopardy protection. Now, if somebody is found guilty in a criminal case, possible punishments can involve things such as probation. It could be a fine. It could be jail time. Or in the case of certain premeditated murder convictions, could even be execution. So there's a whole wide range of possible consequences for a conviction in a criminal case. Obviously, felonies are more severe than misdemeanors. Now, the other area of law that we basically look at here is civil law. Now, civil law is not involving a violation of the legal code. That's criminal law. So what is civil law? Civil law is focusing in on cases where somebody or some group is suing somebody else or some other group, or it's a government suing somebody or somebody suing a government or something along those lines. Basically, it's one party suing another party, claiming that the other party has damaged them in some way. In other words, they have violated their rights. That's where civil law comes from, that your civil rights have been violated by this other party, and therefore you are seeking damages to make up for the damages that you believe have been inflicted upon you. Okay? Now, since this is civil, it's not based on possible violations of the legal code. That means that not only can government file lawsuits, so can any individual or any group. If my dog tears up somebody's yard, the owner of that property could sue me because my dog has damaged their property, and I would, assume to have to pay damages to make up for that. So individuals can file lawsuits. Now, a lot of these rules about how these civil cases go depends on what state you're in and things like that. But generally, when we're talking about civil cases, even though the procedure is pretty much the same for the most part, you've got providing of evidence and stuff like that. Now, it could be a limitation of witnesses, depending on the situation. And obviously, civil cases range, from, big federal lawsuits to small claims court, kind of stuff that you would see on like Judge Judy or something like that. But basically, if it is something that does require a jury, and once again, many civil, like small claims court does not have a jury, it just has a judge make a decision. But, in other civil lawsuits, where it does involve a jury, typically, depending on where you live, you don't need a unanimous vote of the jury to win the case. On top of that, in most states, the legal threshold that would have to be proven to win a case is lower than in a criminal case. Remember, in a criminal case, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning pretty much certain. In civil cases, typically, there has to be just a preponderance of evidence. In other words, it's pretty likely. That's a lower standard than pretty much certain. So there's a lower standard that typically has to be achieved in order to get that victory in that civil case. Now, note, since it's not the government prosecuting you, it's plaintiffs that are filing lawsuits, there are far fewer consequences, or at least I shouldn't say, there are far fewer different kinds of consequences in civil suits if you lose than if you are found guilty in a criminal case. So, for example, you cannot, in a civil lawsuit, have to go to prison. You're not, having to be on probation or something like that. And certainly, you're not going to be liable to be executed. What is typically done in a civil lawsuit, if you lose, you will have to pay some type of financial damage, in proportion to the damage that you have been found to be responsible for. Now, sometimes you see, small individual lawsuits happen all the time, but then sometimes you have these really big cases. For example, back a generation earlier, there were, thousands and thousands of Americans that were beginning to get sick and then eventually die from cancer from a lifetime of smoking cigarettes. Now, today, we obviously all know that is, smoking cigarettes is hazardous for your health, shouldn't do it, yada, yada. But, going back 40, 50 years, there really wasn't quite that same level of understanding of it. And in fact, cigarette companies went out of their way to try to hide and cover up the long-term health effects of smoking that they actually knew. And as a result of this, we saw thousands of people individually suing the cigarette companies for the same types of damages. And what was basically agreed upon eventually was to turn this case into what was called a class action lawsuit. A class action lawsuit is a large group of people all suing the same, person or institution or whatever for the same reasons. And so to save time and legal fees, They agree to lump all these together, and it creates kind of a mega lawsuit. In the cigarette case, class action lawsuit that I was talking about, the cigarette companies agreed to settle for billions upon billions of dollars in damages. Now, of course, this had to be divvied up across, thousands upon thousands of victims that have been damaged. But note, some of these lawsuits can get pretty big in terms of the damages that are awarded. Also note that courts also enjoy what are called injunction power in civil cases. For example, if you're talking about a situation where a government, let's say a legislature, has passed a law that might be deemed a violation of a certain group's rights, somebody could file a lawsuit against that state government, and the court could, at least a court, could rule to file an injunction against that law. In other words, suspend the law pending a higher court's review of it. In other words, kind of pausing the ability to enforce that law until it's actually been ruled on in terms of whether or not it is actually a violation of one's rights or not. So be mindful of the differences between criminal law and civil law. Now, note, there are some other important players in a court case other than litigants. You've, of course, also got lawyers. And if we're talking about, the government being the primary litigant in federal cases, well, we should probably know who is the top lawyer in America, at least in the federal system, and that is this gentleman right here. This is Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland is the current Attorney General of the United States of America. He is the head of the Justice Department. And the Justice Department is the federal law enforcement arm of the federal government. So he is in charge of basically enforcement of all federal laws, and that includes the use of the FBI. Now, we say that the Attorney General, and it kind of is assumed by the title that the Attorney General is the top lawyer, and in a symbolic sense, yes. But really, it's a bureaucratic job. It's really a management job. You do not see Merrick Garland out there actually arguing a case in front of a court of any kind. You just don't see that. And if you're looking at this guy and you're hearing this guy's name, Merrick Garland, you're thinking, I've heard this name before. Well, it's because you may have. A few years ago, when there was a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court, President Obama had actually nominated Mr. Garland to fill that spot, but Republicans in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, refused to hold hearings to confirm Mr. Garland pending the upcoming 2016 presidential election. Hillary Clinton loses, Donald Trump wins, Trump decides to appoint somebody else. So Merrick Garland, came fairly close to becoming a member of the Supreme Court. Now he runs the Justice Department. Now, that being said, if Merrick Garland is really a manager more than a lawyer, well, then who's really actually arguing these cases? Well, that position goes to what we call the Solicitor General. The Solicitor General is responsible for actually arguing the cases that represent the federal government in front of the Supreme Court. That is really, in essence, the top truly arguing lawyer. Now, note, it's important to be aware of other kinds of lawyers that exist. There are also defense lawyers. Typically defense lawyers are privately hired by people, but for those that do not have the means, as a result of the Gideon versus Wainwright case in 1963, you are eligible to have a lawyer appointed for you. So that's important to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that plea bargains are very commonly used. In fact, you know what? I think I'm going to stop it right there. We're coming up on 15 minutes. I will come back in the next video. We'll talk about plea bargains. We'll talk about the impact of interest groups as litigants, and then we'll get into Marbury versus Madison. Okay? We'll see you next time.